Vulnerability assessment, food fraud prevention in the raw material supply chain. A vulnerability assessment is a structured search for weaknesses in the supply chain that could allow food fraud. In this context, food fraud includes deliberate adulteration or substitution of raw materials before they arrive at the site. The purpose is to identify which materials are genuinely vulnerable and then put proportionate controls in place. What it is a specialized form of risk assessment. This is a specialized form of risk assessment. It should be systematic and evidence-based. The site gathers relevant information, identifies significant food fraud hazards, considers the likelihood of occurrence, and decides what controls are needed to reduce genuine risks. The focus is not primarily on fraud taking place inside the site. Under Clause 5.4.4, the focus is the upstream supply chain and the raw materials entering the business. Structured approach from intelligence to control. A practical vulnerability assessment follows a simple logic. First, gather reliable intelligence. Second, identify potential adulteration or substitution hazards. Third, evaluate how likely those hazards are for the material and its supply chain. Finally, consider the controls already in place and decide whether additional action is needed. The assessment should be documented, repeatable, and capable of being updated when new information appears. Scope: every food material must be considered. The assessment should consider information relating to each ingredient or raw material. Where several materials are genuinely similar and their risks are comparable, they may be assessed as a group rather than one by one. That can make the process more efficient. However, grouping must not create blind spots. The important requirement is that all food materials are covered by the vulnerability assessment. Risk information: what makes a material vulnerable? Start with the intelligence identified under Clause 5.4.2, and then look at the history of the ingredient. Has it been substituted or adulterated before? Consider its cost and value. High-value materials can provide a stronger financial incentive for fraud. Availability matters too. A poor harvest, crop failure, geopolitical disruption, or seasonal shortage can restrict supply, increase prices, and create conditions in which adulteration becomes more attractive. Detection testing can reduce vulnerability. The sophistication of routine testing is another important factor. Where the supply chain uses comprehensive, fraud-focused testing, the opportunity to pass adulterated material undetected may be reduced. Fruit juice is a useful example. Depending on the risk, testing can include DNA methods, isotopic analysis, checks for added sugars, and tests for added water. The question is not simply whether testing exists, but whether it is capable of detecting the fraud that could realistically occur. Supply chain factors: origin, complexity, and existing controls. Also consider country of origin, the length and complexity of the supply chain, and the supply chain model. More intermediaries and less transparency can make assurance harder. Existing controls matter as well. Traceability, product testing, supplier audits, and recognized certification may all reduce risk. For example, where a raw material supplier is certificated to the standard, that supplier must have completed its own vulnerability assessment. The standard does not require the receiving site simply to duplicate that supplier's assessment. Material form: prepared materials can carry greater risk. The physical form and claim attached to a material can significantly change the risk. A slaughterhouse receiving live cattle, horses, or pigs can readily see the species presented. But if it makes an organic Aberdeen Angus or specified country of origin claim, stronger controls are needed to protect that claim. The same principle applies to processed ingredients. Beef mince or ground spices are generally more difficult to verify visually than whole meat cuts or whole spices, and may therefore present a greater opportunity for substitution or adulteration. Assessment process. 3 practical steps. The standard does not prescribe one exact scoring method. A sensible process starts by listing raw materials or justified groups of materials, together with controls already operating, such as testing, traceability systems, and supply chain audits. Next, consider the intelligence gathered under Clause 5.4.2 for each material. Then complete a risk assessment that evaluates the vulnerability of each ingredient and determines whether further controls are required. Supply chain mapping map deeply where the risk justifies it. Full supply chain mapping is not required for every raw material. It can, however, be a very useful tool where the initial risk assessment identifies a genuine concern. In those cases, mapping helps the site understand where opportunities for fraud may exist and, importantly, where an effective control can be applied. The depth of mapping should therefore be proportionate to the vulnerability identified. Documented output rank the materials and define action. The output must include a documented vulnerability assessment plan. The plan should rank or score materials so that the business can distinguish those needing additional controls from those requiring routine review only. A very high-risk material may have recent, credible reports of adulteration and require immediate action or enhanced monitoring. A high-risk material may be an attractive fraud target and need added assurance. Low-risk materials still require reassessment when new information emerges. Negligible risk means no additional food fraud action is currently justified. Dynamic review at least annually, and when things change. Food fraud vulnerability is not static. Markets, suppliers, crops, logistics, and fraud methods change. The system, therefore, needs to be dynamic. At a minimum, the vulnerability assessment must be reviewed annually and whenever there is a significant change to an ingredient. The annual review should not become a simple date-checking exercise. It should confirm that the evidence, assumptions, scoring, and controls remain valid. Review triggers. Changes that should prompt reassessment. Typical triggers include a change of supplier or country of origin, deterioration in the financial situation of a supplier or source country, a significant rise or fall in raw material cost, changes to logistics or the supply chain, reduced availability caused by seasonal or other shortages, a newly identified adulteration risk, new scientific information or information from supplier approval, and raw material risk assessment activities that highlights an emerging concern. These examples are not exhaustive. Tools use a consistent, defensible method. Several tools can support a structured assessment. Examples include CAVA plus SHOC and TACCP, meaning threat assessment, and critical control points. The important point is not the name of the tool, but whether the method consistently considers relevant evidence, produces a defensible risk judgment, and leads to proportionate controls. BRCGS also provides vulnerability assessment guidance and training, while the UK Food Standards Agency provides a food fraud resilience self-assessment tool. Key takeaway: know the material, know the supply chain, act on change. To summarize, assess every food material, using grouping only where the risks are genuinely similar. Use current intelligence, fraud history, value availability, testing capability, origin, supply chain complexity, and existing controls to judge vulnerability. Record the outcome, rank the materials, strengthen controls where necessary, and review the assessment at least annually, and whenever significant change occurs. A good vulnerability assessment is not a spreadsheet completed once. It is an active system for protecting the authenticity of the materials you buy.